So, want to set a little bit of the context for this evening and why we thought this was an important topic. In late 2014, President Obama signed an executive order establishing a task force on 21st century policing. It was actually partially headed by Charles Ramsey, who was former chief of police here in the D.C. area. And broadly stated, the objective of the commission was to identify best practices that could help bridge the divides that often arise between communities and their police force. This group held 7 community forums, one of them actually here in the area, and it issued a report late in 2015. The first pillar of that report recommended that law enforcement culture focus on embracing a guardian rather than a warrior mentality when building trust and legitimacy with the public. As we've all seen, at least on television, we've seen what happens when that trust erodes, when those relations really devolve. And it impacts all of us, even if it impacts us in slightly different ways. You know, as someone who's observing that, are they most impacted by the disruption and the damage to property that they see? Are they most disrupted by or impacted by the seemingly impossible tasks that police have in calming and bringing order to these large-scale events? Or is it the exasperation of the violent incident that maybe gave rise to the issue to begin with, often the violence experienced by people of color? There's so much that impacts how we process, how we understand these events. It's a complicated issue. But to quote President Obama, when any part of the American family does not feel like it's being treated fairly, it's a problem for all of us. So Pillar 6 of that same report actually relates to officer wellness and safety, which can easily be looked in this conversation when we talk about how the community is impacted. You know, I work in social services, actually, and periodically we have to call the police when someone threatens to harm themselves, when they're maybe suicidal. You know, this person is having an acute mental episode in many cases, and a police officer has to respond not only for the interest of protecting the safety of that person, but also everyone around. It's a challenging scenario to confront for that officer, and it's really helped me appreciate the roles that we expect from officers that we place them in. We ask them to be guardians, to be counselors, to be social workers, so many different things, wearing many different hats. You know, we can ask ourselves, what are we doing to strengthen their ability to do their job and to do right by the community? Tonight, we're going to take a decidedly local look at a challenging national issue. And we are very lucky to live in a relatively safe environment here in Arlington County. But it's not just luck that makes this possible. It's the work of the folks that we're going to hear from tonight and all of you who work in our community, and really anyone that stands for justice in our community. I'm pleased to welcome our first speaker, who is the Chief of Police in Arlington County, Jay Farr, MJ Farr. Chief Farr has actually been in this role since 2015, but has served in many capacities with Arlington County since 1990. He's served as the acting deputy county manager in the past and is a Marine veteran. Chief Farr has 2 degrees from George Mason University and is now an adjunct professor in criminal justice and emergency management. I'll introduce the other 2 speakers we have after we hear from Chief Farr. So please welcome Chief Farr for us.
What he brought up at the very beginning, I'm pretty sure we could talk about for 4 or 5 hours easy. But I've been told I have about 10 minutes to get this ball rolling, and part of that, I think part of the really good thing about this is I'm really interested about what questions and concerns you might have in a broader sense. But let's touch upon, since you brought it up, the whole concept we talk about community policing and where we are and how we get there. And I've heard over the last couple of years a lot of conversations about, could we become Ferguson? Could we become Baltimore? Could we become X? I think the thing that I would like everybody to think about before you start to go down that road is that if you look at Ferguson, or if you take a good hard look at Baltimore, that didn't happen overnight. That happened through years and years and years of policy about how they manage those communities. One thing I'll tell you about Arlington County, why I don't believe we have that type of incident or capability is, look, at Arlington is an incredibly strong community. For something that is so close to an urban metropolitan center, you have a very strong school system. You dedicate a tremendous amount of your resources to give a very excellent education here. You have a very strong economy. even in our worst times, our economy has been much stronger than many other parts of the country. And I've experienced that in my role as a police supervisor simply because I haven't had to suffer some of the consequences that friends of mine in other places have with reduced ability to do the job because they couldn't meet a basic budget. That's not been an issue here. You have an incredible Department of Human Services. That Department of Human Services, and I listed a ton of things out, but what they end up doing, they end up providing a safety net that allows for a lot of the issues that were able to fester elsewhere, I'm confident don't fester here. We do a lot to make sure before it becomes a problem, we address the problem. You know, I like to kid the county manager sometimes about the cradle-to-grave mentality of Arlington County. But it's true that from the day you're born to the day you die here, there are services in place to make sure that you get the education, that you get the services that you need for mental health, that you get the services you need for economics. All those things lend to it. So when you get to the point of the law enforcement community, the police, it's not about looking and saying, well, geez, all these things happen because of the police. All these things happen because there was a lot of underlying things that allowed it to happen. So I think that I'm pretty confident that I'm not going to see that type of environment here as far as Baltimore goes. But I'll tell you this. We are not, by any means, not susceptible to some of the issues that were talked about specifically when it came to the relations with the police and their community. No matter how much we work, how hard we try to work on that, all it takes is one event, one bad thing, and that can cause some issues for us. So I wanted to give you just a little idea of sort of where we were. When you opened up this thing, you talked about building trust and legitimacy in the community. And while the report came out about 2 years ago, I guess it's been about a year since they finalized it, this doesn't happen overnight. To build that kind of trust in your community takes a long time. I've been working on this since I was a lieutenant when we brought our first community policing teams to the forefront back in about 1993. So the real effort in this community with our police department to build inroads in our community has been going on literally 20 years. And it's developed over time. And to give you some sense of that, we were talking about this at the table, our community policing efforts started a long time ago with what they called community-based problem-oriented policing. You guys, for any of you who may remember this, that they were focused on more criminal activity at the time. It was geared towards, and I was using knock as an example because back in 1992 and 1993, we did have some serious open drug markets in that community. And for us, it was worth putting a very concentrated team to work down with the community and to work with the partners down there to clean that up as best we could. And I think we had some real success. The problem with that, though, is it was focusing all those efforts on one very small segment of that entire part of Arlington County. And about maybe late 90s, 97, 98, I don't know how many of you remember this, we went to 4 districts. Everybody have been around? We reduced that to 3 districts a couple of years back. And we have a district captain assigned to each one of the 3 primary districts. And they have 6 to 8 officers that are dedicated to work with them. And what those district officers do, their sole focus in life is to work with a community on long-term issues and problems. I have a patrol function that goes out and deals with calls for service. So if you're looking for somebody to give a call, 911, it's going to be one of those patrol officers. But if you've got a long-term nuisance problem in your neighborhood, you've got problems or concerns with the kids cutting in the school, it could be a wealth of things. And I can assure you, people call us about everything and anything that has to do with government. Just because we don't actually run streets and because we don't run all these. I'll give you a good example. You remember that little snowstorm we had a couple weeks ago? My press information officer was ready to pull her hair out because they kept calling her and saying, they haven't plowed my road yet. I said, DT, you need to call Public Works. We don't do that, but we are the voice. When you go outside, who's the most accessible member of government? It's us. We wear this nice blue uniform. You know how to pick us out of a crowd, and that's who you talk to. Those district teams, their entire focus is to make sure that they will help route you in the right way, in the right direction as quickly as possible. We've done a lot of work in the Clarendon area. We continue to challenge. Clarendon's a big challenge for us. As you know, that is a pretty active nightlife down there on Thursday, Friday, Saturday night. If any of you happen to get retro and you can get yourself between about 21 to 25, go down there. And it has a capacity of somewhere in the vicinity of about 7,000 people. That I won't say they're all totally intoxicated, but many are on their way. And so our challenge each week in that community is to make sure we get people in and out of there safely, is to make sure that we can keep people coming because it's a great economic tool for the county. At the same time, I don't want to get a call from Mary telling me that there's somebody who's passed out on our front porch. So we have to monitor everything that goes on there. It takes time, energy, and resources, but we work closely with the bars. We work closely with ABC. We work with the fire marshal's office. We do everything we can as a collective to address that. And so when you talk a little bit about sort of the community policing part, it's something that's been built out over the last 20 years. And it's about getting in and going to the civic association meetings, going to a lot of the places where we can make contacts. We're on the list servers. We're on Facebook. We're on Instagram. We're on Twitter. I've only tweeted twice. I don't tweet. But I do check them every day. And I have a public relations officer in the last 3 years has gone from, we had about 380 followers. We're almost at 9,000 followers now. And my absolute favorite one was some teenage kid who wrote and said, man, I never thought I'd be following a police department, but he logs on, he checks us out every day. That's good to know. So we do a little of that. But here's the thing. And no matter what we do and how much we spend our time doing it, you're only as good as today. And so the guidance for my patrol officers and guidance for staff is I sort of look at the whole concept of dealing with the community is it's social equity theory. You're all familiar with that. Social equity says, look, every day you go out, you can either get a credit or a debit. Our goal is to get as many credits as we can because when we give a bad one, we're going to be calling those back in. And it's very simple. And the simple question I would ask every single one of my young patrol officers, and you got to understand, they're young. They're mostly in their early 20s. I've got a very young police department, and they're ready to go. They didn't join the police department just to sit around. They want to go out and get in the action. This is not the most action-based place, but they want to get out there. So we got to temper them a little bit, and we got to make sure that they go out there and understand that the question I want them to ask themselves every single day: if you have an encounter where you end up either arresting somebody or having to take some action against them, I just want you to know that you could say to your wife, your girlfriend, your mother, your father, yeah, that's exactly what I would have done to them. And if you can answer that, if you're confident with that, then I'm confident that you did everything you could do before you did it. And so most of our activity out here is not about arresting people. Most of our activity out here is finding the right resource for them and mitigating issues. I can tell you that in my calls for service last year, which are about 92,000 calls for service, 2 minutes already? Of all the calls for service I had last year, 89% of them we dealt with issues where nobody was getting arrested, nobody was taken in. We were dealing with civil disputes, we were dealing with problems, and we resolved it peacefully. But since I have 2 minutes left, I'm going to hit the guardian warrior thing that you spoke of. The challenge that the officers face today is this: 99.9% of the time, you want us to be guardians. You want us to be peacekeepers and be able to deal with things. 66% of my officers on the street right now are all trained in what we call CIT, crisis intervention training. We learned and manage mental health issues, which are the majority of the problems we run into are mental health issues. And we know how to de-escalate things. We know how to manage them. And so our goal is never to make it a violent encounter. Our goal is to calm it down and resolve the situation before it becomes a problem. So we think about what we're doing. But here's the challenge. You want us to be that all the time. But you also have to know, in this day and age, that they have to be the warrior when they need to be. And so if you look at Paris, if you look at Mumbai, you look at any of the things we're facing every single day, and I'm telling you, Arlington is a target-rich environment. We have to think about that. And so you're asking an officer, a 20-something-year-old, to do a very challenging thing. You're asking him, on one hand, to train to be, the really nice guy, peace officer, almost all the time. But we need to train you to be able to turn it like that and go fully tactical. And that's a challenge. It's a big challenge for us. I think we've been pretty successful in it, but that's probably one of our biggest challenges. And if I have time later, I'd like to talk about the opportunities when we do have a problem, because we do. Police officers are people like everybody else, and they make mistakes. But we have extremely strong policies in place, And we have a very good early warning system in place, and we take very proactive steps to address that issue before it becomes a problem. So I think I got my time, but I'm really looking forward to your questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Farr. Now we're privileged to hear from Commonwealth's attorney, Theo Stamos. She's a Commonwealth attorney for Arlington and the City of Falls Church, and she won election in 2011 after joining the office actually in 1987. She's successfully prosecuted thousands of cases, including capital murder, violent sexual assaults, domestic violence, and drunk driving. She's a graduate of Northern Illinois University and American University for Law School. Please join me in thanking and welcoming Theo Stamos.
Well, good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I'm a member of this committee, so it's different to be on this side of the microphone. I want to start, though, by first introducing my Chief Deputy, Andy Parker, who is with me here tonight. Andy, if you'll stand up, please. Andy is Mary Kay Parker's son, who is also a longtime member of this august body, and he's a great help and obviously a lifelong Arlingtonian, and I'm happy to have him as my right-hand man. So I, like Chief Farr, I want to make my remarks brief so that we can have ample time to have questions. And obviously the topic for tonight is essentially racial tensions and is our community ready for what's happening and what we're seeing around the country. And I'm here tonight to say I think we are. I think we're in a good spot, but we're not in a great spot. Any human endeavor can be improved upon, and I know my good friend Dr. Smith and I, we had lunch not too long ago, for the express purpose of talking about, where are we as a community? Where are we in our conversation about racial tension and how the criminal justice system is being perceived by members of our community? Not across the river, not in LA, not in Chicago, but in Arlington and Falls Church. And we're going to continue to have those discussions, and I know that we're all looking forward to your questions. When Chief Farr says to us here, could Ferguson happen? Could Staten Island happen? Anything can happen anywhere. I mean, we can all agree on that. But as Andy and I were talking earlier this afternoon, the Eric Garner case in Staten Island, I think you all are familiar with. And when I watched that video, not knowing anything about the investigation that ensued after the video that we all saw, my first reaction when the officers went and grabbed Mr. Garner and took him down as forcefully as they did, my first reaction was, I just don't think that would have happened in Arlington. And I say that because now embarking on my almost 30 years with the county, we're lucky to have a well-trained, well-educated police department. And that issue of warrior guardian is a very acute one in Arlington. And when I think about an instance like the Garner matter, and having worked with so many officers for so many years, knowing how dedicated they are, my take on that interaction, I don't think it would have gone that way. Which is not to say everything always goes the right way, but I think we are happy to report that we're moving in the right direction. Some specific strategies that my office is involved with in order to deal with the issue of over-criminalization, over-incarceration, whatever words want to be used. We have, as many of you know, instituted a drug court, which is, I think, a very useful and significant collaboration of many different agencies in the county to answer the question, do we always have to send someone to jail if they're breaking the law? And the answer is not necessarily. If you're a drug addict, if you continue to commit crimes that are low level but still destructive, we want to be able to give you an opportunity to not use drugs, to not commit crimes. And the drug court is that pathway. We have the Second Chance program for our youth, where if you're caught in school, or if your parents even want to turn you in for smoking pot or perhaps drinking underage, they can avail themselves of the Second Chance program to keep kids in school and not have to have them suspended for drug use or alcohol use in school property. Many of you may know that back in May, we had an officer-involved shooting. It was I think it was a Tuesday morning, a little bit before 11 o'clock, and Arlington police were dispatched to an apartment off of Glebe Road. And it was a domestic call. There was an elderly woman who was in her 80s living with her son, who was about in his mid-50s. He had a history of violence, and he also had a history of mental illness. When the police arrived, they had arrived because neighbors had heard a lot of shouting and some concerns about the well-being of the elderly woman in the apartment. So police arrived at the scene, they entered, and things got very tense very quickly. The suspect was wielding a long rod that had a very sharp end, and he refused to release that. An officer, they tried to get him to come out of the apartment. They were working with him to try to quell the situation, and he attacked one of the officers. He sliced open the officer's face across the cheek, and at that moment, the officer who was struck tried to use a particular use of force, which was a taser to stop the attack by this individual. That didn't quell it, and ultimately, and quite sorrowfully, unfortunately, the officer shot and killed that man. Now, you know, we talk about, you see officer-involved shootings around the country, you see protests. You know, people were not marching up Glebe Road in protest of that officer use of force in Arlington that morning. And I think that is a testimony to the, I would argue, I would submit to you, the idea that what happened that day was an unfortunate but necessary response in a situation that, at the end of the day, the officer could do nothing other than use deadly force to protect the individuals involved and to stop the attack. And when that was then turned over to my office to investigate, we spent a lot of time and we investigated that case as if it were a crime. And the result was a 17-page report that I made public and was issued in September, documenting why it was that that officer was justified, and all of the interviews that were, all the information that we learned, the interviews that were conducted, the reviews that we did, ultimately resulted in my determination that it was a justified shooting and there would be no criminal charges. So that to me was a very meaningful way to go about dealing with an officer-involved shooting, and there's a lot of debate among prosecutors whether or not I'm capable of investigating our own police department, and my view is that I am. I mean, that's what you elect me to do. Sometimes folks will, there's a discussion among prosecutors to sort of switch so that, you know, Ray Morrow in Fairfax would investigate our shootings, and thank God there are not a lot of them, and I would investigate his, which they have more. So I'm like, I don't think so, number one. But my response to that deal is, well, I don't think that's a very good idea because I'm elected by the folks in Arlington and Falls Church. If I bring someone else in to do the investigation and you don't like what happened, you can't hold him accountable. You can hold me accountable by not re-electing me. And that to me is a meaningful way to make sure that you believe that you're getting the services that you elect me to perform. So those are the kinds of issues that we deal with. I know we're probably going to get some questions about police body cameras, body-worn cameras, the big rage. I'm very glad that the collaboration with the police department is such that when Jay decided that that was going to be a move that the police would make, it's being deliberate. We're involved with the decision-making. We're involved with the concerns that are going to be part of having every officer wearing a camera. And it's going forward, and I think it's a salutary thing. But again, you know, no human endeavor is perfect. We are teammates, but we're not always. It's not always in sync. We have our disagreements. We have our tensions, and that's how it should be, because there can't always be this simpatico that goes on where it's just monovision. So I'm happy to report that I think things are in a good place. I think they can always be better, and I do know that Dr. Smith will help us with that consideration too. So I'm going to sit down and yield the floor to Dr. Smith and then to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Theo. So now we hear from Dr. Leonard J. Smith, the Reverend Smith. He's the Senior Minister of Mount Zion Baptist Church here in Arlington. Dr. Smith has led Mount Zion Baptist since 1991. Since then, Mount Zion has grown both spiritually and numerically. This includes spreading the gospel through missions work, through tutoring, food assistance, and more. He's also served as the president of the Virginia State Baptist Convention, and has been a chaplain for both the Arlington County Fire and Police Departments, so he knows the departments well, along with numerous other boards and commissions in service to the community. He has a Doctor of Ministry from Union Theological Seminary in Dayton, Ohio. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Smith.
Good evening, and thank you for the privilege and opportunity to address you tonight on a subject matter that certainly garners my attention. And let me just kind of begin by talking about how wonderful the Arlington community is. Arlington is a great place to live. Arlington is a world-class community. Arlington is a community of diversity. Arlington is a great place to be born and a great place to die. It really is. However, we cannot ignore a truth that we may not always really recognize. And the reason we don't recognize it is not because we want to ignore it, but sometimes we're shielded by our perspectives from many of the realities of our community that don't necessarily take place on our street and in our neighborhood. Yes, if something were to happen tomorrow, we would not be another Baltimore, we would not be another Ferguson, but the reality is we're one court case away from being another Ferguson or Baltimore. What I really believe about the Arlington community is it would not become what Baltimore and Ferguson became simply because of the community collaboration that we have. What community do you know that a community leader and the Commonwealth attorney sit down to have lunch, not at the urging of anyone, but because we want to be proactive so that we can be postured to serve the community in the best way we can in the event something does happen? One of the challenges that many in the community have is depending on where you live, you don't see certain members of our community that are to be respected until something bad takes place. And so if you happen to live in one of the pockets and outposts of Arlington where people live who don't have good government jobs, who don't work for tech companies, who don't work for lobbyists, but they work and receive minimum wages, or they are day laborers. If you go to those communities, they have a totally different perception than those of us who are in this room. And we cannot ignore that. Truth of the matter, we always talk about racial profiling when it comes to police departments. But I would ask you to consider something that many times we don't discuss. Yes, there are persons who are guilty of racial profiling, but sometimes it is not completely racially driven. Let me help you understand what I mean. If you were walking down the street and there were 6 young men with dreadlocks who were African American walking down the street, you might feel a little cause for concern. If you were walking down the street and you saw 6 Caucasian brothers walking down the street and all their heads are bald, you probably have a little cause for concern. If you're walking down the street and you see 6 Hispanic gentlemen walking down with baggy pants and hoodies, you would probably be a little concerned. If you saw 6 Asian gentlemen walking down the street with their hair pulled back and multicolors in their hair, you'd probably be a little concerned. The reason I bring this to your attention is because, as one lawyer said to me one time, one young man by himself is no problem. But if you get more than two together, you've got a potential problem. So the truth is, much of what people consider to be racial profiling is sometimes, yes, racial profiling, but sometimes it's not. It is sometimes profiles that we create based upon the attire that people wear. If they don't look like us, they don't talk like us. The truth of the matter is, in this community full of diversity, you might see all four of those groups on a different corner. What are you going to do then? But the one thing we cannot forget is that people from different communities have different perceptions. And if we're going to be good at preventing such outbreaks in our community, we have to do a good job at managing the perceptions of people. Because we all know a person's perception is their reality. If you grew up in a community where you saw the police as your enemy and you moved to Arlington, you will not see the beautiful blue as your friend. And in many communities, this is very, very real. I grew up in Baltimore. When I grew up in Baltimore, when the police came, we started running. We weren't doing anything, but we started running. That was the culture. That's what we were taught to do, just run. If you ask, why are you running? I don't know, I'm just running. Because the police is coming. And so if you relocate from that area, you bring that mentality to this community. So we cannot live in a vacuum and believe that those kind of ideas and thoughts and perceptions don't exist in our community. But when you have a police chief that you can call if I have trouble in the community, and Chief Farb wasn't the one, but our community has been blessed with good police chiefs where I could call on the phone. And I've had one of our chiefs come to my office and sit and speak with a father and a son because he felt like he was being mistreated. When you can call the Commonwealth's attorney and speak to her and not her assistant and talk directly with her about a case, about a situation, it makes for a good and healthy relationship. And when the community has a good relationship and a healthy relationship with the system that we often look at with disdain, it helps us to be a healthier community. And that's why it's so important for us not just to see law enforcement when something goes wrong. Community policing is a wonderful thing. It's not a bad thing to see the judges in our community outside of the courtroom. It's not a bad thing to see the Commonwealth's attorney at a community event. These are all wonderful things, and I think these are the kind of things that make the difference in the Arlington community. And so I look forward to answering your questions that you have tonight. I am so excited about being here, and I just want you to know it. Thank you so very much.
Yes, Chief R, could you elaborate a little on the camera policy, and is there a downside to it?
And thank you for remembering that question. So I get a lot of questions about the body-worn camera. And you know, it was one of the things that came out last year, and it talked about, well, should every agency in the country have a body-worn camera system? And was that going to be the answer to a lot of the complaints and the issues going on around the country? We've taken a very long-term pragmatic approach to this, because the first question I would ask before I'd even consider whether we go to a body-worn camera system is, what is the problem the cameras are going to solve for us? And I think it's sometimes really good to I want to give you some relationship as to what our complaint rates are and what the problem it's going to solve. But in the short version, the cameras themselves, the simple device, very inexpensive, maybe $800 a piece. The challenge for us, though, it's not the camera. Every camera that we put on every officer for 220 officers records data. that data, if it's marked for evidence, has to be maintained. And if it's a felony case or a misdemeanor case, it goes each year exponentially. So you start off with this much storage, then this much storage, and this much storage. And a lot of our cases, the minimum retention period is somewhere 30 to 50 to 70 years for felonies now? Library of Virginia records? And so think about 70 years worth of data that you're going to have to store over time. It's tremendously expensive. If you add on top of that the cost that it's going to take to maintain and manage those 220 cameras, which I know is going to be at least 1 to 2 FTE full-time equivalencies for me, and then you start to think about what's the time I have to spend to redact information out of it. So if I get a FOIA request, you have to redact the information out that's not relevant to the criminal activity or the case. All of that starts to add up and up and up. We looked at an initial view, if we decided to go with body-worn cameras, it's about $1.5 million for the first year. And then it goes beyond that. And at the end of the day, the camera only shows you what it shows you. It has a very limited view, it has a very narrow view, and it's going to have to look at every single camera that shows up there. Does it capture everything? It captures when it's on. So then we get into that whole question about when is it on and when is it off. Initially, the ACLU, when they were doing the audit, said they wanted it on all the time. And then they thought, that's not such a good idea, because if it's on every minute of every day, it means it's on when I go into your house, it's on when I'm talking to a victim, it's on when I'm talking to a witness. It's really critical for us that we have the opportunities not to have it on, so I have a witness who's willing to talk to us. So I'm having a victim of a sexual assault that's not going on the video. That when I go into your home, I'm not recording the interior of your home. Fourth Amendment issues are a big one. And so none of those have been worked out yet. The technology is well ahead of the law on this one. And so we're taking an approach that we're going to look at it. I'm assigning a lieutenant to start looking at the entire body-worn camera program. We'll do a pilot sometime this year so I can get real data on how much we use it, how often it's on, and what are some of the challenges with us in the Commonwealth office to bring those to trial. And ultimately, we'll make a decision as to we move forward. But I want to share one stat with you because I think to me it's a relative stat. We did for the last couple of years, we've been looking at the number of people we encounter and how many complaints we get about the police department. So our population right now is about 215,000. Our complaints, this is where somebody felt aggrieved enough that they call the police department and they file a formal complaint, whether it's a racial profiling case, it's an assault case, it's misuse of power, whatever it might be. I'm not talking about where you call them and say, I got this parking ticket, can you do something? Because we get a lot of that. And we get a lot of people who call and say, the officer was really not nice to me. Okay, well, let's talk about what happened. That kind of stuff happens all day. It's handled at shift level. I'm talking where somebody really feels they were violated by us. Last year, out of our average percent of calls, this is calls for service, where a citizen complained against the police was 0.06%. That was what we were dealing with. If I look at our total number of complaints last year, were 40 for a population of 220,000. So my question to you is, what's the problem I'm solving with the cameras? I don't know if they're really solving that because we have a really aggressive method to look into complaints. We look at every single complaint that comes in. We do a formal investigation on it. It either goes to our internal affairs officer down to the street. And I can assure you that if I have an officer that comes up on our radar on our early warning system more than 3 times in a month, we're going to do extra work to find out what's going on. Now, some officers just get complaints because they're out there and they're busy and they make a lot of arrests. Other ones, they get complaints because they've been doing the wrong thing, and we're going to address that. So I think the cameras we're going to look at them, we're going to consider them, but they're not something we're rushing into. That's a long answer.
And if another speaker has a comment on the body camera question, if not, we can move to another question.
Well, just real quick on body cameras, and I'm with Jay on this. I mean, you know, it went across the country. That's the answer to the panacea. Well, it's not, and we're going to probably find that out. And if we have to go with them, that's fine. But it is an issue for prosecutors because we're responsible for making sure that whatever that video footage shows, if we have to review everything because we're ethically required to turn over any exculpatory evidence, and we don't know if it's there unless we review it. So, you know, if the police department ultimately does go to body-worn cameras, it's going to be an increase of staff for us. We're going to need more funding for more prosecutors to review the footage, to redact the footage, to retain it, to copy it, to tender it to defense counsel. So it's a big production, and I'm sure ultimately it'll be worth it if it's done the right way, and we're happy to do that. But it's not something you just go like this and it all becomes all sun and light. So
I'm Joan McDermott. I have a question for Chief Farr. Can you talk about the racial makeup of the police department, the percentage of African American officers and other diverse members of your department?
Right now, and I can get the exact numbers for you, but I can give you approximate numbers. So we're at about 18% African American, and we're at about 7% Hispanic, and probably 3 in Asian Pacific Rim. We have a very hard time in our recruitment efforts, especially for the Hispanic population, and I think part of that challenge is if I can hire an officer that has the skill set, can pass the background, can pass the polygraph, the physical, and all the things that go along with that, that's a really attractive candidate. And we're competing for a very small number of people, as is Fairfax, as is Prince William, as is Stafford. So in this region, it's really difficult to get somebody on board. The African American population, like I said, in our department is about 18%, and I think our overall female-male ratio is about 25% women in the police department, and a pretty good percentage of that is in our supervisory ranks. I know we far exceed some of our other competitors in the area in that regard. But if you'd like, I can get exact numbers for you.
Hello, I'm Carol Dexter, and I appreciate all three of your presentation. This question is for each of you. What is the status of gang activity in Arlington County? Thank you.
Well, I mean, it has diminished in large part. Certainly in the 90s, it was quite more prevalent, but we still do have gangs. We do have a prosecutor in our office who is a gang crimes prosecutor who works with an interagency task force on gang crimes. We're seeing aspects of it in human trafficking with prostitution rings, both Asian and Hispanic gangs. Yeah, I mean, it remains a problem, but I would say that because of some of obviously the construction and the areas of the county that years ago were places where the gangs would assemble, have been now turned over to condominiums and new construction. Forces have moved them out, but it's a problem that exists, that still remains. I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, so what I'd say to that is Theo's absolutely right. In the mid to late 90s, it was much more prevalent. It died down a little bit. I've seen a little bit of an uptick in the last year, but part of that is we are a member of the Northern Virginia Regional Gang Task Force. This area was very proactive many years ago to address it at the earliest onset and didn't let it become a major problem. And because of that, we've got a really strong intelligence unit capable of really looking at these things fairly quickly. But we have seen an uptick. Where it's going to go, I'm not really sure. I haven't seen a lot specifically in Arlington County, but I have seen an increase out in Loudoun and an increase out in Prince William County.
Thank you. I'm Scott Pedowitz. Chief Farr, in talking about the warrior-guardian dichotomy, you mentioned that you have programs in place to try to intervene with staff before they go over onto the warrior side too much or do something inappropriate. Anecdotally, I feel like when we hear high-profile stories from elsewhere in the country, a lot of times you hear about folks who were rejected by the U.S. military finding their way into police forces. What are your sort of hiring screens? Do you have those in place? Are there things you would like to do to help make sure that potential bad apples don't even get onto the force?
Sure, to answer, well, a little bit on that, I'll answer both those questions because there are really two questions in that. First, as far as hiring. We require a minimum associate's degree, but I can guarantee you that almost every single person I get now has a 4-year degree. Many of the officers I have coming on now have some level of graduate school, if not graduate school. We have a pretty solid initial testing phase. I hire 1 out of about 220 applicants. So out of the 220 people apply to the police department, 1 of them will get through. And so you're going to go through the initial hiring phase. You're going to come in. We're going to look at your record right off the get-go. If there's something that is a disqualifier for us, felony drug use, recent crime, some minor things, traffic and stuff, we can move through depending on how recent they were, etc. But any felony, it's an automatic disqualifier. Any other things we'll consider. You get through that phase, you'll go through a series of interviews, you'll go through there, we'll put you through a polygraph, we'll put you through a psychological, and then if you get through all that, a very thorough medical, and then we're going to put you into you talk about the other side of that coin. Our backgrounds are pretty extensive. While we have to rely a fair amount on the polygraph, it's pretty extensive on the background packet to follow up, where you've been, what agencies you may have worked for. Because your point is, I've seen that happen in other areas. We've never had that happen. Can't say it could never happen, but we've never had that happen. The flip side, you ask about the warrior issue, though, that comes through training. It comes. My whole philosophy is training is from hire to retire, and the training is designed to get you up the skill set necessary to do what you need to do. But a lot of what we do is built into our training. It's not always, the gun doesn't always win. A lot of times the mouth wins. We teach you how to de-escalate a situation. We teach you how to bring things down, and we constantly change things up on our training so that nobody thinks that the one resolution is the best resolution. So it's a combination of things.
Hi, Chief. Kelvin Manners. I run a reentry program here in the area. And I was down in the Nauk community over the last week. I noticed the police there the entire time, and police activity. My question is, what is the percentage and the age range of individuals that are causing issues down there? The other piece I'd like to ask you is, what are some innovative ways that the Arlington County Police Department is using to address the youth that are in this area? And the percentage I was asking about is for the youth.
Okay, well, I don't have the exact numbers on these. I was going to see if I think I may have brought one of our, I know that when you're talking about the arrest rates, our arrest rates are something like 44% of our arrests are outside of the county and the rest are inside the county. It just depends on, I guess, what area you're talking about. I'd have to get specifics for you as far as the numbers in Nauk, but I can talk a little bit to you as far as what we're doing. The 3rd District team, and Damon, I don't know if you met Damon, the 3rd District team, Damon Washington and the crew that works down there, has invested heavily over the last few years to have really strong relationships with the Nauk Civic Association. But it doesn't end there. We do the Coffee with Cops program, which, if you guys have not heard that, we try to do this frequently throughout the year. We're going to set up and advertise that if you just want to come and talk to your police about anything you want to talk to us about, we set up these meetings in the evenings and the afternoons that you can stop by, and it's an informal. As Dr. Smith said, it's not about the problem, it's about an informal contact. We've done programs down there with Behind the Badge. We're going to do that again this August. It's a pretty comprehensive program that when we advertise this in August, that you'll have our community policing teams down there. We're going to spend the entire day running you through a series of scenarios if you choose to participate, so you can get in and see what it's like to have to make a decision, and see a little bit from our side of the picture. But at the same time, we have outreach into the schools. Our elementary schools, our elementary and our high schools all have SROs designed to get into the community there. We also, if you haven't seen it, over in the 3D this year, the Team Kids, you heard about that one? Team Kids is a program that's designed out of California. It goes into the middle school, the elementary school. It targets mostly 4th and 5th graders. And I think it's a fascinating program, because what it asks those kids to do is it asks them to come up with a plan to address a community issue. And actually, they have a carnival, and they raise money, and they take the initiative to do things for their community that they choose to pick. And so we're trying to do a fair amount of outreach in that regard. And I think the biggest thing is staying connected down there and meeting with not just the members of the community. We were trying to work a little bit closer in the churches. Got a pretty good relationship with Karen Nightingale, the NAACP. And so we try to keep that line of dialogue open. And that's the best, for us, it's the best we can do. To get the numbers for you, I don't have exacts on the Nauk community, but I think that you'd find that the arrest rates down there are going to be pretty consistent with the area that they're operating in. So when you say you saw a lot of police down there, what was the police activity?
Oh, I was inside. I just noticed that there was constant outside the window.
Hmm?
There was an event at the pharmacy.
Okay.
Then there was an event at the school, which is why my concern was what was the age range of the individuals. Because again, I know that I'm a returning citizen myself.
Right.
And I know how that plays. Once you get branded with returning citizen, you're branded.
I understand.
You know,
the goal. So for the goal for us, so when given the
why I led
opportunity, is to get them out of the system. The goal for the police department is not to have an arrest of a juvenile. The goal is to get them in the juvenile system and either diversion programs, second chance programs, or other alternatives, so they never end up in that system. That's really our goal.
Nicolati. Gentrification is a growing issue, and I've noticed gentrification is coming to Knock. Will that lead to increased community tensions?
You go ahead, you can take that one.
Oh, it's great. What I can say is whenever a population feels displaced, there are some feelings and frustrations that are very natural. I think the Knock community, when you talk about the older, it's an older community, and many of the citizens are seniors and that kind of thing. So I think that helps in that when they transition, you don't have that kind of frustration. But when you talk about the younger age groups, and you really have to look at, once again, the perception. I'm being moved out of my community to make room for condos. I'm underemployed already. And here is the key. Where do I go? And that's the struggle, because where do you go when you're in a place, you're living in your grandmother's basement, or in the home with 3 generations, and now this change comes. And sometimes I don't think we do a good enough job in terms of preparing for that change and helping the community to be equipped with that. So there will be some frustrations. There are some frustrations, but I think they're manageable if we do a better job at communicating what's happening and helping people to transition. But when you just put someone out of a community that they've been accustomed to and they really have nowhere to go, that's when sometimes individuals turn to the best way they know how to sustain a lifestyle. And that's a sad truth that we really have to look at and deal with.
I would add just a little bit. We had a real issue in Langston Brown community this last year, because they are really going through a transitional period, and there was a very strong, 2 very strong opposing views within the Civic Association up there, each taking a different side. And if you can imagine, for us, we are doing everything we can not to get in the middle of this as a police department. We've got to walk that line. But our district team, our captain, Pat Donahue, and his team spent a considerable amount of time working with that community to find some common ground to work through that. But it's exactly what you're talking about. It's a community that has had some serious changes, and is a brand new influx of people coming in that are just seeing from a different perspective, and it's causing some friction up here.
My name is Katie Kelly. This is a question for Dr. Smith. What is your general feeling about the congregants and the people that you serve attitude towards the police in this community?
Generally, the attitude of the congregation is a good attitude, and I think one of the things that helps is, we have officers who stop by the church, just stop by, not to arrest anybody. Although on Sundays we get tickets, Chief, but that's really, there's a pretty healthy feeling. There's a pretty healthy, and that's one of the gems of this community, is that there's a pretty healthy feeling. Now, there is a population of the community that does not attend church. And I would dare say, in that population, I would not dare say that their perception is equal to that of those who attend church on a regular basis. Because a part of belonging to a church that's sensitive to the community, you hear messages and you have forums and meetings to discuss these kind of things, but when people don't take advantage of that, they don't get the opportunity to hear, some of the things that would be needed. And so some people do have the perception that the police are not our friends. When I was growing up, we used to have police officers in school, but they were called officer friendly. And we were taught that the police is your friend. And so that's why they gave them the name officer friendly. Now we see much on television, more on television about the not so friendly officers. And that skews our perception, even when it comes to our community. If that's all you see, you're bombarded with on television, you start looking sideways at our police, and certainly we don't have the same issues and the same problems. I hope I answered your question.
I just want to add a little bit. When we were at our table, we were talking about this, and you're absolutely right, Dr. Smith. You're going to see the bad action by the police 1,000 times, repeated over and over and over again. And I am the first to admit that there are officers that do the wrong thing. We're human like everybody else. But what you're not seeing, and what we have had to be placed upon us, I have a public affairs office now that their sole mission is to put out the positive message about the work we do every day. Because the other 800,000 officers in this country go out there and do the job for you right every single day. And yes, there are some bad apples. The challenge I face in the Knock community, there's two areas that I have a real challenge with. Knock is one of them, Langston Brown a little bit. The African American community has a long historical issue with law enforcement, and much of it's well-deserved from officers that came long before me. And so that is carried over all the time. And there's a perception. I was on a talk show, and it sort of amazed me. I was listening to a doctor, and he was talking about how when he gets pulled over by the police, he starts getting all stressed out. And I'm thinking to myself, it's a regular traffic stop. He's thinking, because he's based upon his background and his beliefs about law enforcement and the police, even though I know we do what we can, we've got to overcome that every day. I have a challenge to make sure that our officers understand that that is a perceived issue, and you need to be able to police for activity, and you need to be able to articulate that, and you need to be aware of it. Because when we give that contact, a simple action, I remember I had a complaint come in because a gentleman was stopped, and the officer asked him about the car that he had. It was a leased Mercedes-Benz. The officers just asked him about the leased Mercedes-Benz. The gentleman took it to the perception that he was asking him that because how could he afford the Mercedes-Benz? It's the exact same, both of them are looking at the exact same set of facts, and one of them sees it entirely differently. That's a challenge for us. The other side is in the predominantly Latino community, who come from a lot of Central American countries where there is really corrupt police, and trying to build any inroads with them is very difficult, and they're very suspicious of us. But at the same time, that's a community that most needs our service, and we need to encourage them to be willing to talk to us. So there are some historical challenges we face every day that it's a tough thing to teach somebody who's 22. They just don't have a lot of life's experience. So I agree, it's a challenge.
Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule. We could give our guests